Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Julia Chen. I'm the Activities Director at the Yale Club, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to our virtual lecture series, where we bring in a live speaker to do a talk and a Q&A that you can participate in from the comfort of your homes. Today, we are excited to welcome Professor Valerie Hansen. Professor Hansen is in the History Department at Yale, teaching courses on both Chinese and world history. She recently published a book titled The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began. In the course of writing this book, she traveled to some 20 different countries and was a visiting scholar at Xiamen University in China, University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and the Collège de France in Paris. Having lived in China for 6+ years, Professor Hansen has visited at least 300 temples, climbed the Great Wall multiple times, once during a lightning storm, and posed next to the terracotta warriors 11 times, all in the company of her husband and 3 children. Her books include The Silk Road, A New History, The Open Empire, A History of China to 1800, Negotiating Daily Life in Traditional China, Changing Gods in Medieval China, and Voyages in World History. In her talk today, Professor Hansen will explain how in the year 1000, for the first time in world history, an object or a message could travel all the way around the world, and how this early globalization made it possible for Europe's reach in the worldwide market. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me on a beautiful summer day. At least it's beautiful here just outside of New Haven. I live in Brantford. And I wanted to start by saying that I've just finished, there's the Pourvu Center for Teaching and Learning at Yale was just running an orientation for faculty who'll be teaching this coming year. And as you may know, that the university has opted for a hybrid model. So there's going to be a lot of online teaching, but there will also be some in-person teaching. And one of the things that I learned at the workshop was that people tend to stop paying attention to in a Zoom session after about 10 minutes, which is a chilling thought. And so I'm going to take questions from the audience at about 10-minute intervals, and then to combat Zoom fatigue on your part. And also, that's part of the role of the poll, is to engage you and keep you awake. We'll come back at the end of the lecture to the answers. And so let's start. I'm going to share my screen now and start with some slides. Okay, so Julia mentioned, here's the cover of the book that it just came out in April. And I was going to say, so the talk is going to be about 3 different groups of mariners. We'll start with the Vikings, and then the Malayo-Polynesians. It's a mouthful, and it's really the name of a language. So it's a combination of people who are, it's a language that developed into modern Malay and also to all of the languages spoken in the Pacific, in Polynesia and, for example, Hawaii. And then we'll end with the Chinese. So I wanted to start with this map of the Viking voyages, just to show you where they went. They start in Denmark and then go to Iceland and then to Greenland. And then this information is mostly from the Icelandic sagas. They go up to Baffin Island. The Icelandic sagas describe journeys that stop at 3 places, and they give us these names. So Helluland is slabland, and Markland means trees. There's lots of trees. And then the final place where the Vikings went in the sagas is called Vinland. There was big debate about where Vinland was actually located, but we have archaeological evidence at Lanshaw Meadows. This is on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in Canada, of a Viking site, a Norse site. Here's a picture of the site, and it was discovered in 1960 by a Norwegian diplomat and his wife, who was an archaeologist, Anne Ingstad. And they traveled on that route I just showed you from Baffin Island, past down the Labrador coast to the northern tip of Newfoundland. And when they arrived at Lansall Meadows, they asked the locals if they knew of any possible Norse settlement. So they were using the clues in the Vinland sagas to look for the settlement. And the locals said that there were some collapsed houses that they thought were actually Indigenous peoples, the First Nations of Canada. They didn't think that they were Norse, but they showed them to the Ingstads, and the Ingstads began to dig there the following summer, 1961, and dug for 7 years. And they found, among many other things, this bronze pin, which is was used. And they found it on the last day of that they were digging. And Anne Ingstad says in her memoirs that she let out a holler because she was so excited, because this pin matches exactly pins. It's made out of bronze. It's about 3 inches long. It matches exactly pins that have been found in Iceland and Denmark. And it was used. There was when people, they wore cloaks that they put around them, and then at the neck, this pin, there was a round part like that, and then the pin went through it, through the cloth, and that's what held the cloak on. So there was other evidence at Lansall Meadows that the Norse were there. There was evidence of ironworking, and there was metalworking going on in the Americas in the year 1000, but no one was working iron. So it had to be somebody from outside the Americas who was working iron. The next piece of thing that I'll show you is from this site, the Goddard site, which is now we're in Maine. So we're right on the border, the Canadian border with Maine. And the archaeologists found this penny that, it's funny, whenever I look at it, to me, it looks like a chicken. I see an eye and an open mouth, but it's actually the profile of a king, of a Norwegian king. And it was minted, King Olaf, it was minted between 1065 and 1080. And that's important because the evidence at Lansall Meadows was that the Vikings stayed for only about 10 years and then they left. And this penny is from a later period after they left around 1010. And it shows us that, and we also have some evidence from Greenland, that the Viking voyages continued between Greenland and North America, probably for several centuries. The Vikings came back, we think, to get wood, because there was no wood, trees didn't grow on Greenland, or they had grown on Iceland, but once the Norse settled in Iceland, they eliminated, the trees stopped growing because of the pressure of people on the land. So they were always in chronic shortage of lumber, and that's probably why they came back. So most people, I would say that the evidence is good that the Vikings arrived. Not good. The evidence is incontrovertible that the Vikings arrived in America before Columbus around 1000. One of the things that I want to talk about tonight is whether they could have gone farther, if they could have gone farther south. And there's some very interesting evidence. It's also very problematic, and I'll show it to you, that they may have reached, some Vikings may have reached the city of Chichen Itza, which was the biggest city in the Mayan world in the year 1000. The famous Mayan cities and the main settlements were all in here, that were settled in like 700 and 800. But in the year 1000, those had been abandoned, maybe because of climate change. And the largest city in the Americas, was Chichen Itza. It had a population of around 40,000 people. And some of you probably have been there and seen some of these buildings. This is a famous building that on the solstice, there's it looks, the sun casts a shadow, looks like a dragon is dancing on the edge of this staircase. It's got the biggest ball court of any Mayan site anywhere in the Americas. And then it has this building called the Temple of the Warriors. And it's a beautiful building. And it's now, when you visit the site, you can't go into any building on the site. So you can't go into the Temple of the Warriors. But in the 1920s and 30s, a team of investigators from the Carnegie Institute from Washington, D.C., went into the Temple of the Warriors, and they recovered some murals that were in terrible shape. These no longer survive today. So the only thing we have are the watercolors that they made. And here is, I think, the clearest possible Viking who was in Chichen Itza with, you can see blonde hair and light eyes. And then you can also see that his arms are tied behind him. This is the original publication that was done. And these paintings, these watercolors were done by Anne Extel Morris. And you can see here's another captive. We know he's a captive because someone is holding his hair. He's also in the water. And then the Maya put the beads in the hair of captives. This might be the prow of a Viking ship. Everything was very fragmentary in the 1920s and 30s when this work was done. And then there was a hurricane and everything was destroyed. So this is all that's left. And then this is this is a mural, a panel where you can see, again, a captive with the beads in his hair. In a different building at Chichen Itza called Las Monjas, which is the nunnery, and it's called that because it had a garden, and the Spanish assumed that any building that had a garden had to have nuns in it. The Maya did not have nunneries. But you can see this boat, and it's quite interesting. There's no Vikings, no Norse are shown in this picture. My assumption is that the Maya captured this boat and used it. And a key detail is the planking in the boat, because the Maya and all of the peoples of living in the Americas used trees and made dugout canoes. The only people who in the Americas who did not make dugout canoes were the Chumash, who lived near modern Santa Barbara. So this is, I think, good evidence that, or suggestive evidence of Viking presence. Yale's great professor of Mayan studies, Mike Coe, died last fall at the age of 90, the venerable age of 90. And he thought that this evidence was better than the pictures of the captives. We can talk about the problems with the paintings of the captives. And then this, just for a comparison, is an excavated Viking ship that you can see on display in Oslo. I just read that there's going to be a new museum, but this is a very beautiful museum just outside in the suburbs of Oslo. Okay, so now I will stop screen sharing and open the floor for questions.
While we see if any other questions come in, can you speak on the problems with you mentioned we would talk on the problems about the drawings.
Basically, there are two arguments against the reading too much into the blonde hair of those two men I showed you, or the multiple men who are in the water. And one argument is that the original pigments may have shifted so that when the copies were made in the 20s and 30s, that their hair had been a different color. And then the other argument is that Maya artists may have just used color to distinguish between two sides in a battle. We have some other paintings where one of the sides, there's a lot of the paintings are about conquest and battles and fighting. And one of the groups of the people shown in the painting have black and white, like stripes on them, sort of zigzaggy stripes on them. And that might be like war paint, but it's also might be an artistic convention.
We have a question from Howard asking, did Vikings leave any written records of their voyages?
Well, they talk about so the Icelandic sagas were written down in the 1200s and 1300s, and they were oral accounts that people had passed from one generation to the next, mostly about the accomplishments of their ancestors. So that's the written evidence we have for these voyages. And they write about going to those three places, and that I showed you on that first map. And the Ingstads were reading those
sagas when they were looking for the Norse sites. They used the information in the sagas to find Lanzaw Meadows. Oh, someone asked about the Vinland map. Well, the Vinland map is, and here I'm quoting my colleague who has, Anders Winroth, who has left Yale and is just starting in the fall at University of Oslo. His view, and actually that of multiple experts, is that the parchment in the Vinland map is genuine because it dates, the dating is correct for the parchment to around, I'm trying to remember when it's supposed to have been made, but I would say it's around 1200 or 1300. There's actually a book in the Beinecke. The Vinland map was sold with, the Beinecke bought the Vinland map at the same time it bought some other manuscripts, and the other manuscripts are missing a page, and like a page that was on the outside of acquire a group of pages. And so we think that the forgers who made the Vinland map lifted the map out of the book and then made the Vinland map from genuine parchment. But they used ink. They used ink that had chemicals in it that were only available in the 20th century. So so whenever you read about the Vinland map, people who say it's authentic are talking about testing the parchment, and people who say it's a fake are always talking about the ink. And then another problem with it is it doesn't look like any map that existed at that time in the 1200s and 1300s. How were they financing their that's interesting. We know that a warband leader led the voyages, and his followers were with him, hoping that they would get plunder and he would give them a share of it. So, and in the case of Leif, the sagas tell us about Leif Erikson, in Icelandic is Leif Erikson, and the sagas tell us that he bought the boat of a man who had been blown off course and visited those same three places. So he was the son of a warband leader named Eric the Red. So he had enough money to buy the boat. That's what everything I know about finances. How far did the Vikings get in Europe? Oh, well, that it's funny that at the same time that they're going west into the Americas, they're going east into Eastern Europe, and they mix with the local people, and they become the Rus, and they basically get control of Ukraine. They're the founding dynasty of Ukraine. And we have some evidence that they get as far as Khwarazm. So that is in Western Uzbekistan, because there's an inscription in Scandinavia about a man who dies in Khwarazm. The identification of the name is tentative, but most people find that persuasive. What was the climate like in Vinland at the time? That's a great question. It was the sagas tell us it was warmer than Greenland. Well, what they say is that there was more sunlight in the winter, that there was 6 hours of sunlight. And they say that in Vinland, wild grapes grew, and maple trees, and there was lots of salmon. So before the discovery of Lanzaw Meadows, I think most people would have said Vinland was somewhere in New England. I think most people thought it was a little warmer than Newfoundland. And there's a big debate about, so we know for sure that the Vikings were at Newfoundland, but how far south did they go? And, they could have easily have gone to Nova Scotia or Maine, but they may have gone farther and just not left any traces that we have found. Okay, now I'll go back. Okay, now the second group I want to talk about are the Malayo-Polynesians, and you can see here that their voyages were in the Pacific Triangle, and they're traveling. We know this, that they're moving from the mainland of Asia very early on, like in the BC centuries BC, and then moving into and arriving in Polynesia in the core of the Pacific Triangle around 1025. These are carbon-14 dates. That's the reason for the range. And then something happens when they're there that prompts them at the same time to go in 3 directions, to go north to Hawaii, east to Easter Island, and west to New Zealand. And they arrive in these 3 places at roughly the same time. And something that puzzled archaeologists before they figured this out about the simultaneous voyages was that the artifacts that they found in these 3 points on the triangle were so similar. But once they realized that they had all left from Polynesia at the same time, it made much more sense. We don't know, the archaeology, we haven't recovered the kinds of vessels that they were traveling in. It seems likely that they were traveling in these boats. This is a painting by someone who was with Captain Cook. And you can see that they had a double canoe. And then between the 2 canoes, it's very hard to see, like it may not even be there, but we know from modern ships that they wrapped the canoes together, they tied the canoes together, and they had a wooden frame that joined the 2 canoes, and they could carry things on the 2 canoes. When they traveled with animals. So when they landed in Easter Island, in Hawaii, and in New Zealand, they had pigs with them, they had rats, and they didn't want the rats, we assume, but the pigs were their foodstuffs. And we know that they traveled with women. So that sometimes people say, oh, they weren't really exploring, they were just blown off course. I'm not sure that those things are so distinctive, because with the Vikings, the first person who gets to Vinland or sees it is someone who's named Bjarni Herjolfsson, and he too is blown off course. So this is probably the kinds of vessels that they were traveling in. The techniques that they used were actually a lot like the Viking navigation techniques. Neither the Vikings nor the Malayo-Polynesians used any navigational instruments. And the Malayo-Polynesian system of navigation, we know a fair amount about the traditional system that was transmitted over the generations, because this man shown in the picture here, Maupilog, had learned the traditional system, and then he started teaching it. No one wanted to learn it in the traditional way from him, but a bunch of Westerners, and then also a bunch of people outside of his family, like anthropologists, and Steve Thomas, the host of This Old House. Before he became the host of This Old House, he spent a couple years studying with Maupilog. They studied this system, and basically what Mao is teaching here is a series of constellations that he's teaching his son to memorize these constellations that are in the sky in different positions. So you look at the sky using the system, and you see the constellations, and then you can locate yourself. It's really quite remarkable. The Vikings didn't have this system, but they were also navigating by landmarks and by looking at the ocean. These are things Maupilog does too. Looking at waves, looking at animals. If they saw a bird, they knew they were close to land. If they saw certain kinds of seaweed, they knew they were close to land. So this is how we think, because this is reconstruction, how the Malayo-Polynesians navigated around the Pacific. And this is a map of Maupilog's trips. And this first trip he took in 1976 was quite remarkable, because he led a traditional vessel, this boat, you can see the double canoe with sails, all the way from Tahiti up to Hawaii. He'd never been on the trip before, but he had the knowledge of the stars that allowed him to orient the ship and get there. He was a difficult person by all accounts, and he's died. He's now dead. And when he got to Hawaii, he discovered that one of the journalists who was covering the voyage had put a radio transmitter on his double canoe. And he was enraged, because he felt that people could say he hadn't gotten there by means of traditional navigation. He'd gotten there by means of the transmitter. So he refused to go back. So they had to get the boat back to Tahiti. Other people had to sail it back. But by that time, they had learned his technique, so they got home. And this is where he was from. In this neighborhood here is where he, this inset map here shows this. This is where he grew up, and he sailed around and used his traditional navigation techniques to go around, I guess you could say, his neighborhood in a way. And in 2003, he was on a trip from one island to the next, and he was he was 2 weeks late. His family was very worried about him, and they thought that he'd gotten lost and maybe even died. So they called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard went to talk to him, and they found him, and he was furious. I told you he was irascible, furious, and said to them, "I know exactly where I am. There was a storm. I was blown off course, but I know where I am, and I don't need your help. Leave me alone." So they left him alone, and he eventually got home. So I was going to say, an interesting person. If it weren't for him, I don't think we would really know about this traditional navigation system. Now, another voyage, so those voyages take place a little bit after the year 1000, right? The move into Polynesia started, the earliest date is 1025. Slightly before that, the Malayo-Polynesians moved to Madagascar. And Madagascar, you would think, given its location, that it was first settled by people from Africa. But what really surprises people is that the first settlers in Madagascar came from the Malay Peninsula. And we know this because of linguistic evidence. The main language on Madagascar is Malagasy, and it has much more in common with Malay than it does with any of the Bantu languages spoken on the African continent. People also plant rice, and they plant mung beans. And the Malayo-Polynesians were arriving in Madagascar starting around 700. So the settlements were firmly established by 1000. And you can see the voyage, the route from, this is the Malay Peninsula up here, to Madagascar, was basically a straight shot. And it makes sense that they could have used the Malayo-Polynesian system of navigation to get there. I think that may be, yes, I was going to say, time for our second break.
While everyone types, I was actually really interested to hear about when you talked about how they brought animals to the different islands that they visited. Have we been able to trace certain distinct species or impacts on native species to these animals that they brought with them, whether intentionally or unintentionally?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, we can, and there's specific dates for the arrival of the dog, I think is 700 in Madagascar. The place with the most famous impact is Easter Island, because the Easter Island, when the Malayo-Polynesians arrived, pretty sure that it was empty, no one was living there. And they arrived and they had their pigs, and they basically laid waste to the whole environment. So there were no trees and no animals. They're living in kind of dire poverty, where they're making fishing nets out of human hair, because the only thing that's left in Easter Island are the people. Any other animals are gone. So I think some people have an idealized view that traditional peoples were easier on the environment than we are. There's actually a lot of evidence that they were just as bad for the environment. Well, I won't say they were just as bad as we are, but they were bad too. We might be worse, but they were bad too. Okay, so that's so Heyerdahl, Thor Heyerdahl, and with his Kon-Tiki trips, he was trying to show that he did not agree with what I've told you. He felt that people left South America and traveled to Easter Island, and that's what he was trying to show with Kon-Tiki. I think really no serious analyst thinks that's true now. One reason that you can't go from or it's very, very difficult to go from South America to Easter Island is that there's a major current that's preventing you. The Humboldt current is preventing you from making the trip. And everyone thinks that the Polynesians came from Melanesia and settled the Pacific, originating in the west side of the Pacific and moving across the Pacific. And yes, those are the people who built the Moai statues on Easter Island. That's before they had depleted all their resources, when they because I think the most persuasive explanation of how the statues were moved is that they were, you rolled giant logs to move them across from where they cut the stone to where they placed the statues upright. Okay, we'll go back to the third group, to the Chinese. Okay, now this is the route that the maritime route that had the most traffic on it before 1492, and it was the longest route that had was the most heavily traveled. And it goes, so Guangzhou used to be, it's the same place as Canton in the old spelling of Chinese. And the route went around Southeast Asia, through the Straits of Malacca, around India. You can see this, to the Persian Gulf. And then there was an add-on route that went down the coast of East Africa. Actually, both of these routes, both halves of the routes, were Hajj routes, Islamic pilgrimage routes, and so the port that everyone went to was gave you access. It's funny to this map doesn't really show this, but it allows you to go into the Arabian Peninsula and to go to Mecca and Medina. That the Chinese were traveling this route. Originally most of the mariners were Arabs, as far as we know, and then there's a switch around the year 1000. There's some attacks on the Arabs who were living in those Chinese ports, and it seems to have deterred them, and they pulled out of their settlements, leaving the trade for the Chinese to take over. This is a picture showing you the things that Southeast Asia exported to China. They all fall under this broad category in Chinese, xiang, which is, now it's the word for perfume, xiangshui, but it's fragrances, it's spices, it's, I was gonna say, so it includes these things, like this is a kingfisher bird, so feathers, and then there's spices, so like these are cloves here, and fragrant woods like sandalwood. And these may not sound like they were major imports, but people in China were consuming these in huge quantities. And they were exporting these different things, so ceramics, metal ingots, which were used for money, and then objects made from metal, like cauldrons and woks and mirrors, and also high quality fabrics. Silk is the most famous, but this was a hot part of the world, and silk wasn't that practical in that part of the world. So silk was probably not as important as we sometimes think. And these have left different archaeological traces. So we know much more about the ceramics and to some extent the metal than we do about the fabrics, because the fabrics have left, they disintegrate in ocean water. And this is a picture of the good that everybody in the world wanted in the year 1000. Everybody in Afro-Eurasia wanted the iPhone of the year 1000, which was high-fired Chinese vessels, shiny white ceramics. They were easy to clean in a world where very few things were easy to clean, and they were much coveted. And each ceramic that archaeologists find on this route tells the archaeologists where they were, where the ceramic was made. They can look at it and know where the kiln was, where it was made. The Chinese had a huge advantage. Unlike the Vikings and the Polynesians, they did use navigational instruments, and they had developed the compass. And we have a very interesting source from the son of a port official who tells us how the Chinese navigators navigated this route. They were familiar with the outline of the coast. They knew their direction. They could tell that from the sun's shadow. This third thing really interests me, and I hope to find out more about it. They collected samples of mud from the ocean floor to determine their location. And he tells us that they took a very small bag and put a long string on it, and then dragged it along the ocean floor and picked up the mud and then looked at the mud. He doesn't tell us what the different kinds of mud were, or what kind of information they could derive from the mud. And then he says if it was cloudy, they could use the south pointing needle, which is the word in Chinese for compass. This is a shipwreck. It's not from the year 1000, it's from later. It's it sank probably 1276 to 1277, but you can see that it was a wooden ship with very distinct compartments. Let's go back for a second. I thought I had a picture of that. And the compartments had a huge advantage, which was that if the ship sprang a leak, the water the leak would be limited, the impact would be limited to that compartment. So the ship wouldn't go down, it would just have a leak in that one area. They had an advantage too, that the Chinese sailors sometimes dedicated a compartment to water, and it kept fish in it so they could eat fresh fish. So it's a very different kind of travel than Columbus's men who are surviving on hardtack for their whole trip. So here we can see the Chinese route. So here's the answer to one of the quiz questions, is that the Chinese went the farthest, because you can see here that if they hugged the coast, they went about 8,000 miles to get to Basra, and then from Basra down to Sofala on the East African coast was another 4,700 miles. Columbus's trip was about 4,000 miles. I think Columbus travels 4,400 miles. So the Chinese this route means that they go farther than Columbus did. One thing you'll have noticed is that the Chinese travel along this route, along the Southeast Asian and South Asian coast, but they don't travel to the east. They don't go past the Philippines. And a possible explanation is that there was a traditional Chinese belief in the ultimate drain. So the Chinese believed that all the water in the ocean came out of one source, the ocean filled up, and then it all drained out like a bathtub into another place. And there are some reports actually from that same book that talked about the mud sampling on the ocean floor of sailors getting close enough to the ultimate drain that they could hear the noise of the sucking noise of the drain, and they were terrified that they were going to die. And then the wind shifted and they were able to escape. So the most likely location of the ultimate drain is in here, where there's a major current that goes around the Pacific called the Kuroshio current. Okay, so we get to our poll, the end of our poll. I think, so in terms of who reached the Americas before Columbus, the Vikings definitely did. I've shown you the evidence from Lansdowne Meadows. The Malayo-Polynesians, I think, probably did not. There's a debate. Sometimes people say that they did because it has to do with the chickens, If the Malayo-Polynesians reached the Americas before Columbus, then the chickens that are found, they brought chickens with them, and so the chickens that are in Latin America come from with the Malayo-Polynesians. This has to do with the dating of the chickens, and the most recent work dates the chickens to after 1492. So so that it seems unlikely. Possible, but I would say unlikely that the Malayo-Polynesians got to the Americas before Columbus. The Chinese, I'm glad to see some of you, 5 of you, said this, and perhaps you were influenced by the book 1421, that's a book that it's by Gavin Menges, and I was going to say it's a book that Chinese historians love to hate. And one year I taught a freshman seminar where I divided the footnotes among the whole class. And at the end of and everyone checked all the notes and concluded that none of them had any convincing evidence, nothing like the bronze pin found at Lansdowne Meadows that the Chinese had arrived in the Americas. And then in terms of who traveled the farthest, surprise, the Chinese. Right? The Malayo-Polynesians are traveling, basically their journeys are about the same length as Columbus's. So even that journey from the Malay Peninsula to Madagascar is about 4,000 miles, but which is about what Columbus does, where the Chinese are traveling on that route that I showed you. And their total trip, if they go all the way to the Islamic world and then south along the East Africa coast, they can travel almost 3 times the length of Columbus's voyage. So The final thing I'd like to say is that, yes, something very important happens in 1492 and 1500 with the voyages of da Gama and Magellan. The Europeans are the first people to circumnavigate the world, but before they do that, there are systems of regional pathways in place around the world, and when the Europeans arrive, they connect those systems together. So they're not coming and drawing a system of trade routes. They're not creating a system of pathways on a blank slate. They're building on a system of pathways that predates their arrival by about 500 years. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have a few more questions probably coming through. One came in a bit late about the last part, is asking, how did they cut the stones on Easter Island?
I think usually the answer is by making sandpaper or sand string that you could pull. It's pumice stone, so it wasn't that hard to cut. But that's a tentative answer. I confess I don't have a good memory for that. I also think it'll be supposition.
And it also was very curious to hear that as you put it, the hot commodity, the iPhone of the year, was that white ceramic. Right. I feel like whenever we think of China, we think blue. Is there just a time difference for that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, blue on white gets going a little bit later. So that's probably the blue on white. The famous ceramics that we all think of are like in the 1300s. So in the earlier period, around 1000, there's a lot of solid color ceramics. So there's celadon, sort of a bluish green, and that's very popular. And then those white ones, and there's also tan ones, but they're almost all solid colors that I can think of, the ceramics from 1000. Is that true? I'm thinking, I just thought of some from the 700s that are painted. So there's some, but there's nothing like, there's the blue and white with those patterns and just two colors. There's nothing like that in the year 1000.
I wonder if you, could make some guesswork, if they didn't have that whole theory thinking that the ocean ended. How far do you think they would have made it, the Chinese?
Yeah, it's funny. At the end of the book, I speculate and say sooner or later, they could have crossed the Pacific. It wasn't that hard. The Polynesians were doing it. And there's a very famous story, not a very famous story, a not very well-known story, but an interesting story about 3 Japanese sailors. There's 14 fishermen are sailing around Tokyo Bay in the early 1800s, like 1820s, and they get caught in a storm and they're blown off course. And a year and a half later, they land on the coast of Washington State. And the 3 of them have survived, 11 have died, and they're actually taken prisoner by the native peoples living there. And they had no sails. Their boat was destroyed. The mast was snapped in the beginning of the storm. So it shows you it's possible to cross the Pacific without even trying to. So I think the Chinese would have made it. I actually think it's also possible that some Chinese did make it and we just don't have any evidence of that. Right? They're sailing in the Pacific. They could have been blown across. When I was talking about the possibility that the Vikings were blown to Chichen Itza, that would be my supposition. One of the Spanish explorers arrives in the Yucatan. He's not an explorer, he's an explorer, but he's a friar. And he comes to this village and he talks to people and they say to him that their village is named for an African leader. They were founded by dark people like Moros, people who came from Africa. And so, that those people deliberately sailed from Africa to the Americas. I think it's much more likely that they were blown off course. So I think there was much more movement across the oceans than I think we realize. I think we assume, we have a kind of mental vision that you needed to be an intrepid explorer to cross the oceans. And actually you could just be unlucky and get caught in a storm. And if you were lucky enough to survive, you could cross the oceans. I see now.
Yes.
Question here about, yeah, it's well, it's funny. I don't think that I think the Chinese are emphasizing foreign trade all the way between 1000 and to just pick a random year, 1433. That's when the Zhenghe voyages end, and that's when they do the exploration of East Africa. In the 15th century, I think there's a very specific political reason, which is that the Mongols to the north are much more of a threat to them than anything that's happening in the ocean. And they just decide that they don't have enough money to invest in Pacific voyages and also deal with the Mongol threat. But that's something I'm thinking about now. I'm going to teach a course on this next spring called The Chinese Age of Discovery. And maybe I'll have a better answer for you next spring.
And that mud thing is just fascinating. Is anyone working on figuring that out?
I'm going to work on that. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to, you know, the frustrating thing is that book that tells us about the mud is really an unusual book, that it has like better information about sailing life than almost any other source we have. I'm hoping that maybe by coming up closer to the present, I can find people talking about that technique. But it is really interesting. I mean, and I'm not sure, you know, and I'm speculating that it may have to do with when they bring up the bag, whether it's sand that they're finding or mud or maybe plants or fish. I mean, who knows? I mean, there must be differences depending on how close or far you are from the shore. Oh, interesting. So this is from Mort Downey. Tell us what you learned about checking the bottom samples. What information is in them?
I
Mr.
never practiced it. It was just one of the things they said was used from time to time. Particularly if you're getting closer to the shore, you'll see silty residue that's come out from the rivers. But I said never had the chance to practice it.
Oh, good, but you've given me hope that this is a legitimate technique and I can find something out about it.
Yeah, look at coastal piloting books.
Good, excellent. I wouldn't have thought of that. That's excellent.
So I think that's all the questions that we have. Do you have any closing remarks for us, Professor?
No, that's very kind of you. Thank you for hearing me out. I was going to say that in my Zoom training, the very first day they ended early and we were ecstatic. So I think that's also a message about Zoom. It's good to end early, right? Everybody feels relieved. They talked. I was interesting. They talked about how straight people sit, and that they have to focus on locating themselves in the middle of the screen, and that's really a strain on people. So
yeah, thank you so much, Professor. This was so much fun, really fascinating. I think you did a great job with the Q&As in between, and everyone asked lots of questions. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Great, thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. We hope to see you at one of our upcoming events again soon. Check the online calendar. Until then, stay safe, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.